there's big stakes at play here, and China, clearly wants to, do business with Europe, but at the same time dominate and weaken it to a certain extent as well.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. If you are new to the podcast, you might like to check out some of our past episodes, which you can find on our blog site at pwneilo.com or by searching for Perspectives with Neilo wherever you get your podcasts. European Parliament elections take place across the EU in early June. About 400 million voters are eligible to vote across the 27 EU member states. At stake is the makeup of the next European Parliament, the direct link between Europeans and the EU's institutions, and it will shape the direction of the EU over the next 5 years on issues like climate, migration, trade and defence. Ireland is entitled to elect 14 representatives, or MEPs, across 3 constituencies to the 720-seat Parliament. MEPs generally sit in political groups, ranging from left to right rather than by nationality. In this episode, we're talking with Billy Kelleher of Fianna Fáil, who is up for re-election as an Ireland South MEP and member of the Renew Group. We discuss a range of topics, including the future direction of the EU and the influence of the far right, security and trade risks posed by China, and whether Ireland is out of step with the EU on adoption of policy tools and a physical trade presence in Taiwan. So Billy, thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and you're very welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You've been Fianna Fáil MEP since 2019 and a member of the Renew Europe group in the European Parliament. Why have you decided to run for another term?
Well, I mean, you'd like to be adjudicated on your performance in terms of the first 5 years of your mandate. I'm an outgoing MEP, so, I want to be re-elected for a number of reasons, but primarily to continue the work that I've been doing. I mean, Europe matters to Ireland. It matters in terms of investment in students, small and medium-sized sector, agriculture, environmental issues. So right across the full gambit of, the economy and society, Europe matters to Ireland. So from that perspective, I want to articulate the view that I feel represents Ireland best in Europe. And that's a centrist, liberal view in terms of market economy, but also having, the options of state intervention, government intervention when the market fails. So, for example, in the area of housing.
Okay, yeah, that's one of the contentious topics, I suppose, on the agenda in being discussed at the moment. But what would your top issue? Is that one of your top issues? What are the main priorities in the manifesto this time around? Well,
the main priorities in the manifesto are ones that are relevant to Europe and what competencies Europe holds. I mean, very often, people campaign in European elections on issues that Europe has no competency on. But primarily, from my perspective, the European Union is primarily a trading bloc. It is a single market. It is now evolving into a political union as well. So it's within that space that I want to campaign. So the issues that are most relevant to Europe, obviously the areas of agriculture, the economy itself, ensuring that we remain competitive, not just in Ireland, but as European Union bloc. Investment in research and innovation, I think that's a big area where Europe has to do an awful lot more. We've fallen well behind the United States in terms of innovation, and creating the next generation of companies, and we're even falling behind in terms of Asia as well. So there's an area there where I believe that Europe has to do an awful lot, and that means investing in students right across the STEM areas into third level, and then ensuring that we have proper tax incentives and investment in the areas of research and innovation just to create that dynamic.
So Ireland celebrated 50 years of membership in the EU last year. What do you think are the things that have gone well for Ireland as a member of the EU, and where do you think there's room for improvement?
Well, I mean, Ireland's been utterly transformed. I'm 56 years of age, so when we joined, I was 5 years old. In that time, Ireland has completely transformed. I mean, the two most important moments from the point of view of the Irish people making decisions was one, first and foremost, independence in the 1918 election, and then into the War of Independence, and then in 1972, the Irish people voting overwhelmingly to join the European Union. So we had political independence, you could argue, up until 1973, but we didn't didn't have economic independence. We were still very dependent on the UK. And when we joined the European Union, that put us into a position where we could develop our own capacity, increase our own abilities, invest in our own people. And I think we've done that well. We've had hiccups along the way. We've hit very rocky roads in terms of recessions, financial crisis. But overall, the direction of travel and trajectory of the Irish economy, has been one of enormous expansion and enormous investment. And we really have, come from the bottom of the league, where we were joining in 1973. Many countries thought that Ireland wouldn't be able to sustain the pace of the single market. It wouldn't be able to, integrate into the EEC at the time. It is now the second wealthiest per capita of GDP in the Union, and that is a phenomenal achievement.
So economically we've done well, but what would you say are the areas maybe where we could do better, or areas for improvement?
Well, you always want to be ambitious for the people and for the nation. So, areas where we want to improve, obviously, in the area of housing, health. There are two significant challenges for the Irish government. They are primarily competencies of the Irish government as well, in terms of Europe has little say in the areas of health and housing. But what we want to do is to make sure that we have a dynamic economy that can underpin our ability to invest in these particular areas. But I think overall, there's very few negative areas that I can identify in terms of we joining the European Union. Certainly from the point of view of liberalising our society, the influence of the European courts and decisions that were forced on Irish governments to make decisions around equality, around the gender equality as well, for example. There was huge significant judgments there that forced Ireland to improve on those particular areas. So I think there's very few areas that I can identify that were negative.
Okay. One of the things maybe I'd like to ask you about is Ireland's adoption of some of those things. So the European think tank network on China, they published a report in July of last year. It contained a chapter on Ireland-China relations, and it presented a checklist of different EU policy tools that were benchmarking Ireland's China policy. And more than half of them, 4 out of 7, are not under any consideration at all by the Irish government, of which your party is a member. So if you look at things like FDI screening mechanism, EU 5G security toolbox, and legislation to allow blacklisting of networking equipment from high-risk vendors, those things have been enacted by the Irish government. But the kind of 4 other areas that haven't been moved on at all are, national contact point for knowledge security. You mentioned innovation earlier on, a toolkit to help mitigate foreign interference in research and innovation. Information and a contact point for local government, I suppose, to inform them and help them understand China kind of issues if needed, and assessment of strategic dependency on China. So given Ireland is 50 years now in the EU, do you think we're a little out of step with maybe some other EU countries in not adopting these policy tools, the goal of which would be to safeguard the EU and EU member states like Ireland?
Well, Ireland has had strong diplomatic relations with China for a long number of years. I've attended trade missions myself when I was a Minister of State to China. We are trying to build up links in terms of investment and foreign direct investment and trade as well. But in the meantime, China for a long period of time was becoming more open in terms of its outlook on the world. It has now become more open, but also aggressive in terms of its influence in the world as well. So there's a fine line there. Ireland has diplomatic relations. We do trade with China, but yes, we also have to accept that China now is becoming a very significant player, both economically, militarily, and diplomatically as well. And you have to recalibrate that from time to time. But in terms of the strategic risks to Ireland and to the EU, they are primarily around the areas of interference, cybersecurity, issues like that. I don't believe that there is military threats to Europe at the moment from China. And I would like to think that we should remain in a phase of dialogue with China, both in terms of diplomatically, but equally in trade as well. And I don't believe that, the hardline views that we should just say no to everything from China is the right way to go. I believe that we should have some form of engagement. If you look at the US-China relationship, very often they'll argue like that they're, they are very much opposed to each other, but let's be honest, they're also close partners in most things in terms of trade. They might have tariff impositions, they might have trade wars from time to time, but overall they still are very much part and parcel of a dynamic of trade. So I don't think that Europe should all of a sudden cut itself off from that.
A recent news article from Politico entitled "Bullets Not Bees, EU ditches green focus ahead of June election." It reports that a leaked draft of an EU priority list for the rest of the decade contains many references to defence, security and migration. In 2019, climate was front and centre. However, in the latest document, climate change is barely mentioned at all. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think you have to look at that particular document and the direction of travel of Europe over a longer period than just the last few years. I mean, like when the wall fell in 1989, that's the Berlin Wall, when that came crashing down in 1989, there was a period after that where, relationships between Europe, the new Eastern Bloc countries, the expansion of the European Union itself, and a closer relationship with Russia was evolving. It was taking place. That has taken a strategic different paths now, as is very evident. So there was a long period of time where the European Union was very much in the direction of travel of building up close relationships with Russia. That has changed fundamentally. So the European position has changed as well. So, I mean, the threats to our defence or security are very real now and are very much in the minds of particularly the Eastern European countries are now members of the European Union. So obviously, there's going to be a rethink and a recalibration of policies. So, I mean, for a long period of time, we were looking towards embracing Russia, that soft diplomacy. Trade was building up, as you can see, from a point of view that we were actually very dependent on Russian gas and Russian oil. So strategically, we had put ourselves in a very vulnerable place, but it wasn't. It was based on a policy that was, from the 1990s rather than now in the 2000s and 20s, where Russia is now a very aggressive neighbour.
Are you concerned by the reports that this draft document has been shaped by the increasing influence of the far right in the EU?
Well, I mean, there is certainly a reaction to, what the far right are raising now. I mean, like the far right is quite broad in many ways. I mean, like for example, you can look at Meloni being elected in Italy. She certainly expressed very strong far-right views in advance of the election. She's tapered her language and her policies a little bit, but at the same time, my concern is that it would drag the centre to the right, and that would become very reactionary. And I mean, the centre must defend its position in terms of its philosophy, its policies, its outlook in the world. And yes, I would be afraid that we become reactionary. But I mean, the issues are security and migration, and they're interfaced and they're interlocked at the moment. So I think we have to be conscious of that as well. How do we deal with migration in a fair, firm, humane manner? And then how do we guarantee the security of the European Union, bearing in mind the European Union doesn't have a standing army, and it primarily will be done by NATO.
But recently there's been a spate of arrests of Chinese and Russian spies across Europe, and there's also been claims of Chinese Communist Party interference and backing of some of these far-right entities. For example, EU media reported that the Alternative for Germany party, the AfD, has picked Maximilian Krah as its lead candidate in the upcoming EU elections. Krah is a vocal supporter of the Chinese Communist Party since joining the European Parliament in 2019. And on April 23rd last, it has come to light that prosecutors in Germany have arrested a man who has been working as an assistant to Krah on allegations of passing information about the European Parliament to Chinese intelligence. So, you've been an MEP since 2019 and having spent time in the EU institutions. What do you make of these kind of allegations? And are you concerned about China's level of interference in the EU?
Well, yes, I am. I'm concerned about China's level of interference in the EU, but equally Russia's interference in the EU as well. I mean, that has been very obvious for some time. There was a report commissioned by the European Parliament a number of years ago where it estimated, that there could have been up to 400 million spent in the European Union in the previous years, interfering with the democratic process, funding far-right organisations, funding just disruptors, and just trying to destabilise from within the European Union. So that is happening, and nobody should be surprised that China is involved in this as well. There's no doubt there's big stakes at play here, and China, clearly wants to, do business with Europe, but at the same time dominate and weaken it to a certain extent as well. So from my perspective, and as a member of the European Parliament, I take very seriously that issue of threats to the European Union, both in terms of cyber threats, obviously the military threats coming from Russia and elsewhere, but on top of that, just the interference with the democratic process and our election process.
I mean, you have been very critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and you've visited Ukraine on a number of times to see the impact of the war on the ground firsthand there. You've commented how Russia has a lot of weapons and a lot of resources, which raises the question, where are all these resources coming from, given the sanctions that have been put in place? Something we don't hear much about, though, is, in this country especially, is China's role in all of this. China has made no secret of its support for Russia. CCP officials, including their leader Xi Jinping, who last visited the Kremlin in March 2023, have frequently spoken about how China is deepening their relationship with Russia. And trade figures show how bilateral trade between China and Russia has increased dramatically since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On a recent visit to China, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said China was powering Russia's war by supplying microelectronics, chemicals for munitions and rocket propellants, and dual-use items that Moscow is using to ramp up its defence industrial base. So, I mean, you were one of the MEPs who pushed for sanctions and other measures on Russia very early after the invasion. What's your view on this China-Russia partnership? And do you think the EU should sanction China on this basis?
Well, I mean, the purpose of sanctions is to hurt the enemy more than it hurts yourself. Russia invaded Ukraine. I called immediately for sanctions in terms of the use of Russian oil and gas, and that we would try and deplete the Russian economy. Once you start going beyond that, obviously, clearly then you're into a completely different sphere altogether. I mean, Russia is receiving military equipment from North Korea. There's no doubt that China is certainly supporting it, and Iran. And yes, I mean, if there is evidence of, they're providing weaponry and things like that, well, then clearly we have to revisit our relationship and recalibrate our relationship with China and with others that are involved in supporting Russia. Primarily because, I mean, if we are trying to limit Russia's capacity to wage war on a neighbouring country, and at the same time China is funding that war in indirect or even direct ways, well, then that is a significant problem. And yes, I mean, Antony Blinken did raise it, but clearly, the United States is still trading with China. Europe is still trading with China, but I mean, we have to try and insist that they, unwind their direct support in terms of what they're giving to Russia that can actually fuel its war.
China has been supporting Russia from the outset. We're a number of years into the war now. China has been supporting Russia from the outset. They've never called it an invasion. They call it an incident or an issue or something like that. I mean, isn't it clear what side they're on? How long do we wait to take some action?
Well, it is clear that they are supportive of Russia, but they haven't committed their entire resources to Russia. Let's be very honest. They are giving support, but they certainly aren't giving the might of their military capabilities to Russia. And I mean, that would be a completely different scenario if they were involved in actually providing, military hardware that could actually, be used in the front lines against a country that Russia has invaded. That hasn't happened yet. That would be clearly a complete and utter change, in my view, of our obligations.
Seems like they're getting closer and closer to that all the time.
Well,
I
actually don't believe that they're actually getting closer on the issue of actually providing military hardware to Russia. I actually think that they, if they were going to do that, they would have done it by now. So I think they're actually playing a longer game. Let's be honest, the longer, from a Chinese perspective, the longer there's a war in Europe, the happier they are.
Yeah, I mean, and there are some analysts who say that a failure to act decisively against China now would open a path for Russian victory in Ukraine. Is there a reluctance among EU members to tackle China on this issue?
Well, I mean, we don't want an escalation of the war, both in terms of the actual military aspect of the war itself, or the implications of having huge trade sanctions against the second largest economy in the globe. That could have profound implications, not just for Russia and China, but it could have a profound implication for the Irish economy, the European economy, the world economy, and the global economy. So the point I'm making is, they haven't started committing their military hardware. There is evidence that they are providing softer supports in terms of technologies that can be reappraised or reorientated for military capabilities. We must consistently call them out on that. But I mean, if we go to the next stage of a full-scale sanction trade war with China, well, then that is a very, very different scenario altogether.
So staying with China and maybe on that topic of trade with the EU, recently the EU Commission put out a 700-page report discussing what it sees as distortions in the Chinese market and how this is driving oversupply and affecting EU trade, particularly in the area of EVs, solar panels and wind turbines. China is also ramping up its rollout of coal-powered electricity generating stations, which it's using to manufacture a lot of these so-called green goods like EVs and so on. According to the Global Carbon Atlas, China is responsible for over 30% of global carbon emissions. So, I mean, doesn't that sound broken to you? Here we are in the EU buying all these green goods to reduce our impact on the environment, and they're being manufactured in China using fossil fuels. Isn't that defeating the whole purpose?
It is, but I mean, China isn't the only one guilty of that. I mean, you look at the United States, which equally is guilty. It only recently realigned itself with the Paris Agreement. The United States has an Inflation Reduction Act. That is an indirect way of subsidising companies as well.
But the United States is not flooding our market with all these green goods.
Well, I mean, but it's a competitor at the end of the day. The point I'm making is there's a lot of countries that are not signing up to their international obligations like Europe is. I mean, Europe is very much to the fore in reducing its dependency on fossil fuels, reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, and yes, other countries are consistently ignoring their international agreements, and that is a major concern. I mean, that is putting huge pressure on Europe in terms of its competitiveness. If you have other countries that are not complying with their obligations under the Paris Agreement, not complying with their environmental obligations, at the same time they are flooding the international market, yes, that is a clear problem.
But do you think we should be doing anything else at the EU level to incentivize China to be a more responsible climate player? This is the Carbon Atlas plot I'm just showing you here with the 30%.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, China, look, India as well, other countries that are, with massively expanding populations, growing populations, they are certainly not prioritising the reduction in fossil fuel use and carbon emissions, and that is a fundamental breach of what we're trying to do globally. But lots of countries are slow in coming to the same position that Europe is, which is very much reducing dramatically its carbon emissions, its carbon footprint, decarbonising our economies. A lot of other countries are very slow in that particular area, and that is causing significant challenges to our competitiveness.
Because it's a global climate, and even if we do so well in Ireland to reduce our carbon footprint, if we have emitters like China with 30% emissions, the climate is still going to be affected, right?
Yes, it is. And of course, when you are looking at that particular chart, you have to also take into account populations. I mean, China and India alone, when you add the two of them together, it is to 2.7 billion, 2.8 billion. So it's quite a substantial number of people as well. Yes, they have higher carbon emissions. A lot has to be done. They certainly aren't coming to the table as quickly as I'd like to see it. But other countries, first world countries, aren't doing it as quickly as I'd like to see it either. And if you look at Europe, it has certainly been the leader in terms of, decarbonising our economy. We have put huge emphasis and investment in that direction. The policies, the legislation, and what we'd all really like to do is the other countries to follow suit, but they're slow, and sometimes they don't have the political appetite to do it, and they're using this to gain economic advantage and competitiveness.
So Europe as a whole has a very strong trade relationship with Taiwan, which it calls a like-minded partner or a like-minded country. In fact, High Commissioner Joseph Borrell has been very supportive of the EU doing business with Taiwan, and the EU have a trade office in Taipei, and around 15 EU states have a strong presence in that office. but not Ireland. Taiwan is the world leader in semiconductor production, leader in offshore wind, and many other technologies and industries. You previously served as Minister of State for Trade and Commerce from 2009 to 2011. Why doesn't Ireland have a trade office in Taiwan like so many of our European counterparts?
Yeah, well, look, I think there's a lot of duplicity and hypocrisy being truthful in this whole issue around Taiwan and China. I mean, most countries will recognise China first. They are having diplomatic relationships with China. The one China policy is one that's recognised by most countries, and what I want to see is to ensure that Taiwan isn't threatened, isn't invaded, but at the same time, if you have full economic or diplomatic ties with Taiwan, and if you recognise Taiwan, well, then you don't have diplomatic relations with China. That is the fact. So you can't have an embassy in Taipei and another embassy in Beijing. You might have a representative, but they're certainly not embassies.
Well, this question is about a trade office, which is not an official diplomatic.
But I mean, trade and diplomacy are
but
separate.
15 other EU states have trade offices in Taipei.
Yes, they have trade offices. That's all.
So that's my question to you. Ireland doesn't have one.
Ireland doesn't have a trade office, but we do trade, and we have had visits to Taipei from members of the Irish Parliament. But in terms of diplomatic relations, let's be very honest.
Yes. My question isn't about diplomatic relations.
Yes.
It's about the trade office.
Yeah, well, look, I mean...
let's look at another aspect of this. Last year, under the EU Chips Act, Germany secured a deal with Taiwan chipmaker, TSMC, to build a multi-billion euro manufacturing plant in Dresden. Countries like Lithuania and the Czech Republic have announced similar research and development partnerships with Taiwan. I've spoken with Danish representatives who are partnering with Taiwan on offshore wind technology. Do you think Ireland is losing out by not having a trade office in Taiwan?
Well, I mean, Irish companies trade with Taiwan every day of the week. So, I mean, you could argue that should Ireland have a trade office footprint in Taipei? Yeah, that's a reasonable proposition. But I mean, let's be very honest. I mean, the bigger issue of Beijing versus Taipei, as long as you keep it in a trade office, that's fine. But the point I was making earlier on at the start of this was that there is a lot of hypocrisy and duplicity when it comes to Taipei and China. I'd like to see that resolved, but in the meantime, I think we should keep trade open to both Taipei and to Beijing. That has been my view for a long period of time.
So sorry to put you on the spot, but what would your position be as an MEP if you're re-elected? Would you support Ireland having a presence in the EU trade office in Taiwan or reopening our Irish trade office in Taipei?
Yes, I mean, from a trade perspective, no difficulty, obviously, because I mean, I see that as a part and parcel of international trade. The issue is whether you go beyond that, and no country is recommending that they will go beyond that. So lots of countries have trade offices. We have links with Taipei. Irish members of Parliament have been over to Taipei. They have visited the Parliament. They have strong contacts. But at the same time, the issue is that there is a one China policy, and that is across.
I'm supposed to be blunt about the trade office. These other countries that have a presence there, seems like they're getting good deals for their countries with key technology suppliers like TSMC and so on that are in Taiwan. Ireland doesn't have a physical presence there. Are we losing out,
Well, I mean, we do have a very significant semiconductor presence in Ireland. I mean, we have Intel and others, I mean, we have some of the largest. I mean, we're a very strategic player when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing.
I think that's part of my point. Given that we already have semiconductor technology here, we have a lot of the supply chain and everything that supports that. You would think we would be an attractive location for a company like TSMC, but we didn't register, it seems. It seems like Germany won that bid.
Yes, well, Germany won quite a number of bids, not only with Taiwanese companies, but it also won, even with American companies and Intel itself in recently with regard to, huge investment coming from Intel into Europe. And that was done primarily because of the CHIPS Act, seen as, strategic autonomy, developing our capacity, and the German government supporting Intel and in attracting them into Germany. But the issue with with regard to trade missions, I'm a firm believer that trade is a very good thing. I don't like, trade wars. I don't like trade sanctions in general. I very much believe that open trade is good for the broader economy, but also even from the point of view that it opens up dialogue and keeps the world talking to each other at the very least. So I have no difficulties with a trade office in Taipei.
So maybe to wrap up then, we've talked about a lot of important kind of questions and topics today, but there are many other contentious issues on the agenda at the moment. We're also seeing EU leaders like French President Macron, who in a recent speech has warned that Europe is in imminent danger. The driving force for his message being that the persistence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the push for a more independent and self-sufficient Europe. So given all of this, I mean, are you hopeful for the future of the EU and what you can achieve for Ireland if you're re-elected?
Yes, well, I remain optimistic for the European Union project. I think it is evolving, it is changing. It is now, started off as an economic bloc, single market developed. It is now a political union. But there's no doubt there are significant threats to it, both internally from the far right and from this sort of move to re-establish national views as the priority over European competency. That is undermining that concept of solidarity to a certain extent. You can see it in Hungary, for example. We do have challenges about how we govern ourselves, how we make decisions, but that is also fraught with danger if we move just to qualified majority in every decision. Small countries may suffer, so I think we have to be very careful with that. But the big issue that's facing Europe is a security threat. That is very evident now. Ireland is a neutral country, so I sometimes feel that, and I've often abstained in votes on this particular issue because, I'm not making decisions. We're not committing Irish troops to frontline. We do support through the Peace Fund, etc., efforts by the European Union to support Ukraine. But I mean, someday, if our way of life, if what we have developed over the last 50 years is under attack, if Russian troops start rolling into some part of the European Union, or if there's threats from elsewhere, well then what does Ireland do? That's also a big question for us as a people and politically as well in the future. But I'm 56 years of age. I won't be the person going to the front line. It will be primarily young men, but it is a discussion that is being had across Europe. How do we defend Europe? We can't necessarily depend on the United States as a solid partner all the time. If you look at Donald Trump's previous statements when he was in the White House previously, and if he was returned or somebody like-minded like him, you look at the right of the Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, vitriolically against any support for Ukraine. So trying to undermine NATO as well. A weak NATO, could embolden Russia, and that's an issue because we're neutral, but it's certainly an issue that we'll have to have a long, deep, hard talk about.
Well, Billy Kelleher, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
That's Billy Kelleher of Fianna Fáil, who is going for re-election as an Ireland South MEP in the upcoming European Parliament election. We would like to thank him for taking time out of his busy schedule to chat with us on Perspectives with Nilo. We've placed links to additional information on the topics discussed in the interview in the Dive Deeper section of our blog, which you can find at pwnilo.com, and where you'll also find links to our social media pages and past episodes. If you enjoy our content, we'd really appreciate a like, share or follow. And thanks in advance for your support. And that's where we leave it for now. Until the next time, thank you for listening. Slán ag Spanacht.